so it's my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Carl Griffin to Dornoch tonight. Sorry, Carl. I don't know what I was going to say then. Carl is Professor of Historical Geography at the University of Sussex, and up until very recently was the head of Department of Geography at Sussex. Now the jammy devil is on a year-long sabbatical, at which he seems to be doing the occasional thing, like publishing a book on the politics of hunger, which comes out with Manchester University Press this coming January. Mm-hmm. That's correct. This builds on his two previous monographs, the magisterial rural war, and then the equally wonderful protest, politics and work. Carl is therefore then a historical geographer of rural social protest, perhaps, in my estimation, the leading historian of social protest, rural social protest, working today. He's not as good as E.P. Thompson, but then...
I'm much better than that.
Yeah, few of us are. As well as working on or producing his latest monograph, Carl is currently working on or working up a project on rural squatting, and also he's here to work with the Centre for History around a possible project on social crime. So he is absolutely the right person to be here talking to us tonight on the myth of riotous assemblies. Carl, before you start, can I just remind folks to please ensure that microphones are off? And without further ado, I'll hand you over to Carl.
Thank you, Ian. I'm glad I'm the right person to be giving this lecture this evening, because my name is on the poster. So it would be strange if it were kind of otherwise. And thank you very much for inviting me here this evening. It really is lovely to be back in Dornoch again. I'm pretty sure the last time I was here, unless my memory serves me ill, was for the fabulous New Coastal Histories conference that David organised. It really was one of the most enjoyable academic conferences I've been to in many a year. And the book that came out of it, with the exception of one chapter at least, is a very splendid
Just got a review of it this week, which I'm looking forward to.
Ian sent me that was a very lovely review, I thought indeed. So thank you very much, one and all. And in some ways, it's a strange thing to be kind of here this evening speaking about food riots in England. England has been the myopic focus of my research, with having briefly kind of dabbled with work on Ireland, where I live, despite working in the south of England. And it's strange in the sense that so much of what I'm going to talk to this evening has extraordinary kind of parallels with Jim Hunter's really rather wonderful new book, Insurrection. Looking at the food riots, particularly around this piece of coast and further north in 1847. Although what I'm going to be talking about picks up upon some of the ideas which I think are very much kind of implicit in Jim's book, rather than kind of teased out. But I think it's kind of complementary in so many ways, and I'm sure somewhere this evening, somewhere kind of in a town hall, somewhere maybe somewhere else in Scotland, probably Jim is kind of talking about his wonderful book. So the great truism of the so-called spatial turn in history and the broader humanities is that everything happens somewhere, and that the somewhere matters in shaping and framing social action and cultural meaning. So much we can hopefully accept. Indeed, studies of popular protest, in particular in modern Britain, have long been alert to the importance of space and, a horrible word, spatiality. From George Roudet's close reading of the contexts of the London of 1780 in his analysis of the Gordon riots, through Andrew Charlesworth's mappings of Hobsbawm and Roudet's tabulations of protest incidents during the so-called swing insurrection that spread throughout much of southern rural England in 1830, and his subsequent and extremely influential Atlas of Rural Protest, which has just been republished by Routledge, I think, through to more recent work. And here I'm thinking of Katrina Navickas at the University of Hertfordshire, and her sophisticated and subtle tellings of the spaces and places of emergent democratic politics in northern England. All these studies relate, I'd argue, in microcosm, not only the long history of social historians' attentiveness to space, but also the ways in which such attentions have become more complex through time, shifting from perhaps initially crude renderings of space as something hard, almost as the isotropic backdrop to the real stuff of politics and economics, to something more recently which has become a little more nuanced, particularly influenced not so much by geographers, but by many social theorists, particularly Henri Lefebvre, thinking about space as something which is produced by social action. So one could argue that we've got to a point that some social historians would even agree with geographers like me that it's all about place and space. Stupid. But I'd argue that perhaps in our obsessions with place and space, we've actually somewhat missed a trick in thinking about social complexity. So I'd like to argue here that in giving such close attention to the placed context of where events supposedly happen, we're in danger of being blind to other possibilities and to other contexts. Indeed, so much is easy to comprehend given the way in which the archive tends to structure most popular actions. So, for instance, in thinking about many forms of popular protest in the 18th and early 19th century, the very Riot Act passed in 1714 but first enacted in 1715 defined the act of rioting as having been assembled in place for an hour after the eponymous text of the Riot Act was read. So here we have something which structures an obsession, historians' obsessions with place. So then, historians of social protest have tended to consider riots as tumultuous and yet curiously fixed, as placed, something that can then be easily mapped, a definitive X marking the spot. What I want to try and do here is argue that might we not usefully think of events not as the crystallization of comings together, everyone having come to one point in one place in a particular moment in time to do what they wanted to do, but instead as something that continues to unfurl, something that happens in sundry sites and at multiple times. And this is for the benefit of Ian, who likes to dabble with such things, as something rhizomatic, as something which is built on a complex network and maze of places and people and times. So the specific protest focus of this paper is the 18th century English food riot, and most of the material I'm drawing on is from the southern counties of England, the southeastern parts of the southwest. Subject to repeated and ever more detailed study since R.B. Rose's landmark paper in the International Review of Social History in 1961 on English price riots and public policy, and especially so since E.P. Thompson's seminal Moral Economy paper published in Past and Present 10 years later. The food riot has, since the publication of those two papers, arguably become the leitmotif of protest in Hanoverian Britain. And rightly so. Food riots were the most common and widespread form of collective action in the 18th century. So subsequent studies have done much to extend our knowledge of the timing of food riots, and we can even think of the excellent work of the medievalist Buchanan Sharp, suggesting that the food riot actually kind of started to take form in the medieval period, through to work on the persistence, universality and complexity of food rioting. Here I'm thinking of individuals such as kind of Roger Wells, Adrian Randall and John Boast, but also kind of interesting and important work looking at the interplay between protesters and the invariably civic authorities. And here, Steve Paul and Nick Rogers' recent book looking at kind of protest and authority in Bristol is a wonderful example. And historical geographers have played their part here too. And here I'm thinking particularly of the work of Andrew Charlesworth and some of Andrew Charlesworth's work with Adrian Randall, looking at the complexity and the geographies of food rioting. So arguably no set of protests in Hanoverian Britain has been subject to so much work and to such close scholarly attention. So as John Archer, the late John Archer, writing now 19 years ago, put it, food riots have been subject to greater and closer analysis than any other form of popular protest, and as a result, the seemingly straightforward food riot has become an event of enormous complexity and variety. And yet, I'd argue, our understandings have remained curiously static. The energy and audacity so vital to any riot assembly has been largely written out. The moment, the assemblages that made assemblies, reduced too often to a hard-placed certainty. Such accounts, I would argue, are wrapped in fixity, enthralled to boundaries, to categorisation, and to a placidness that doesn't tally with social complexity. They speak to some aspects only of the dynamic nature of the crowd. Indeed, protest historians, especially of the modern age, and I'd let the early modernists and medievalists off a little more lightly here, have been so at pains to show the order, the rules, the codes that underwrote crowd actions, so that the contingent, the messy, the powerful, the sheer latent energy of the crowd has often been kind of underplayed or, at worst, ignored. In arguing this, I'm not trying to totally overturn the now paradigmatic understanding that, to quote E.P. Thompson, food riots were a highly complex form of direct popular action, disciplined and with clear objections, and underwritten by a legitimising notion of traditional rights, custom and community consensus. Rather, what I'm trying to do is argue that subsequent historians have been far too enthralled to certain aspects of E.P. Thompson's thesis. They have been blindsided, I'd say, by other more energetic and less predictable aspects of crowd action, of crowd behaviour. To think about the ways in which many kind of forms of collective action were less choreographed than a narrow reading of E.P. Thompson's paper might suggest. And indeed, as Andrew Charlesworth has kind of put it, many kind of crowd actions from a Thompsonian perspective can be understood as being kind of akin to, and I know Ian likes this quite a lot, the stately gavotte, choreographed, predictable, following kind of hard rules and lines. And I'd argue that that's not really massively helpful. Indeed, it is to be blindsided by some of the evidence in E.P. Thompson's moral economy paper that spoke to, but didn't kind of analyse in depth some of these other forms of complexity. So this is an example that Thompson uses in his paper, which is drawn from Horsham in mid-Sussex from December 8. Let's clip over that. From mid-Sussex in December 1800. Can we read this? Maybe it's just my eyesight that's failing.
Yeah.
Okay, so a number of women proceeded to Gosden Windmill near Horsham, where, abusing the miller for having served them with brown flour. So this is in the context of the passing, the recent implementation of the Brown Bread Act of 1800, which kind of enforced millers to produce kind of a flour at kind of less than kind of the perfect kind of white flour for the standard wheaten loaf. They seized on the cloth with which he was dressing meal, and according to the direction of the Bread Act, and cut it into 1,000 pieces. I'd like to think the reporter here kind of counted every little piece of the cloth, threatening at the same time to serve all similar utensils he might in future attempt to use in the same manner. The Amazonian leader of this petticoated cavalcade afterwards regaled her associates with a guinea's worth of liquor at the Crabtree public house. The Crabtree still exists; it's now a gastro pub, which seems rather kind of inappropriate, considering the mere guinea they had to spend. So here we have, I'd say, moral economy codes in action, but also references to something else, and something perhaps kind of deeper and more interesting, something before a plan and an organisation are coming together. Those individuals coming together in Horsham and proceeding out to the countryside, to Gosden Windmill. We have a celebration too. We have an allusion to the future. What will happen to you if you continue to serve us this awful, to grind this awful kind of brown flour? We have also kind of an allusion to a set of journeys home. After going to the Crabtree public house, these ladies, we don't know precisely where they went, but of course they went on. They went on multiple journeys unknown. So here in one short statement, we have multiple spaces and places, known and unknown, multiple actions and temporalities, rather than just one protest, rather than just one moment, one event. So other scholars of 18th century protest have been alive to the role of ritual in thinking about in thinking about and informing kind of crowd action. Here again, Andrew Charlesworth and Adrian Randall's kind of work on sets of kind of protests in and around kind of Bristol in the mid-18th century have been really powerful. But claims that John Archer made that such feelings of movement have been subject to analysis simply don't stand up to scrutiny. It simply isn't true. So if historians have considered movement, it's been in relation to noting the influence of certain types of rituals. So, for instance, the importance of procession-type rituals, like this Skimmington form of kind of exacting community justice, particularly against kind of violent and kind of abusive spouses. The influence of other kind of processioning rituals, like the beating of the bounds, even though this was often kind of a formally kind of sanctioned act of marking out the parish boundary, but often was kind of hijacked and kind of became kind of a rather more kind of lurid and kind of drunken affair. We know from lots of kind of reports of the youngest lads being out on the beating of the bounds, having their heads bashed on kind of boundary stones, so that they would kind of remember precisely the point at which that point of the parish kind of ended and a new parish began. So there is some acknowledgement of the importance of movement, but this stuff hasn't really been subject to much in the way of systematic study, rather the similarity to these forms of kind of ritual noted. The only other way in which kind of scholars of kind of popular protest have been kind of alert to the importance of kind of movement has been thinking about the idea of protest movements, and of course that's movement written in a very different way altogether. So what follows seeks to really try and do two interrelated things. I'm trying to kind of offer kind of a more nuanced understanding of the practice of food rioting, whilst at the same time trying to make some kind of broader kind of claims or ask some deeper questions, offering kind of a new framework, I'd argue, for conceptualising crowd actions as never being just one discrete placed movement, but instead a constellation of actions, places, spaces, and times. In so doing it, I'm trying to kind of look at four major themes, and you might argue at the end of it that perhaps some of them are more successful than others, and that's fine. This is very much a work in progress. So, looking at the heterogeneous nature of many riotous assemblies. So, at the minute, our understandings are that these are actions which invariably take place in the marketplace. They are actions which are carried out largely by urban residents, urban dwellers, urban workers, the tradespeople of the town in particular. Also trying to kind of think more kind of critically about the making of the event, thinking, as I've noted already, about what hitherto has been thought of as the crystallisation of a moment. Thinking about what happens in the making of that moment, the other kind of moments that come together to make that kind of iconic protest. Also trying to think of food riots as mobile assemblies, as dynamic, as energetic, as something that not only often transcended the marketplace, but that transcended any one particular place. Something that was really quite hard to actually kind of pin down, to kind of map accurately, if you were. So here's a geographer critiquing geography. I think that's quite fun. But also thinking a little bit about aftermaths as well. Thinking about kind of what happens after this event. Thinking instead about food riots as having kind of often really kind of complex and quite kind of messy endings, rather than something which can neatly be kind of conceptualised as having happened in one place at one particular time and then having ended. So, I'm trying to do quite a few things here. The consensus amongst kind of historians of food rioting is that the food riot, as I've noted, was often kind of the work of women and men. That debate kind of rumbles on. A complex gender politics being at play in relation to consumption and marketing practices. Food riots occasionally involved, it's been allowed for, unruly colliers and other types of miners, but overwhelmingly they were, as I've noted, the work of the townspeople. So many reports, as John Archer has noted, referred only to the poor as having been involved. But as he goes on, the poor was often, in relation to kind of particularly kind of urban food riots, a shorthand for a broad cross-section of trades that were found in the particular region in question. Though, as I've kind of alluded to, in some kind of areas, other kind of individuals were often prominent. So colliers in the coalfields, apart from the northeast of England, where it's quite interesting, colliers didn't really take a leading role in that many food riots, and also those employed in the textile trades. Often took a leading role in many of the food riots in parts of the Wiltshire, Somerset kind of borders, the West Riding of Yorkshire, parts of Lancashire, and into parts of Cheshire as well. Reports of outsiders, those from outside the town, were rare, and reports of outsiders coming in and I quote, causing havoc, were rarer still. So the received understanding is that food riots were not the work of country people. They were not something that happened in villages, despite the fact that the bulk of the English population in any point of the 18th century lived in villages, lived in small communities, small agrarian communities. Indeed, John Archer, in his work on food rioting, mentions agricultural labourers not once. John Boast, who's perhaps kind of arguably been the most kind of prolific scholar working on 18th century food rioting, claims that agricultural labourers were strangers in marketplaces, and indeed that the field worker would not find himself among a familiar crowd of neighbours. This was a function, as John Boast saw it, of agricultural labourers not needing to visit towns for the purposes of provisioning, instead being reliant upon either directly buying foodstuffs from farmers, from rural millers, or from bakers and village shops. That's problematic, and we'll come back to that. In times of crisis, it's been argued that rural workers didn't need to necessarily engage in urban food rioting or food rioting anywhere, because they were able to pilfer from the fields and farmyards, or were able to benefit from flour and bread subsidised by parish subscriptions or by the poor rates. So the labourer, it's been argued, had no need to engage in food rioting for their basic subsistence. Their basic wants were met elsewhere, whether legally or otherwise. We know that such dependence, or as E.P. Thompson kind of labelled it, the revenges of village paternalism, created kind of other challenges. The labourer, so this argument goes, needed to be deferent, to challenge the farmer, who was probably not only his employer, but maybe also the parish kind of overseer, or her employer, was to be self-defeating. Rather, one might use kind of secret kind of threats and the tools of kind of rural terror to try and achieve one's goals in the countryside. So it's been argued then that rural food riots were very rare indeed. And in John Boast's survey of collective actions in 18th century England, he has a tally, I think it's 617 collective kind of actions, not just food riots, but other types of action too. So anti-enclosure riots in the countryside, for instance, and some kind of political rallies are included in his tally. Only 7% were located in populations, in settlements with populations of 1,500 or fewer individuals. So on that basis, on those qualifications, according to John Boast, food riots were something not of the countryside. Agrarian society was almost untouched by riot. Riot, he concluded, remained a tradition of the towns. There's a contradiction, though, in his analysis and the analysis of other social historians. For he allows for the fact that on occasions, though, agricultural labourers did engage in food rioting, preferring to tackle town merchants or millers and carters in the town rather than engaging in actions in their own communities. So John Archer also allows for the fact that occasionally as well some townsfolk might not do all of their rioting in the marketplace, but might scour the countryside to find kind of hidden granaries, places where dealers, where farmers, where millers were stockpiling food with the expectation that prices might go higher still. But those kind of actions haven't been subject to systematic study yet. So there are problems here. There are qualifications. There are perhaps essentially kind of rather kind of arbitrary kind of judgments being made about what kinds of settlement might figure as kind of rural or not. And it's important to note as well in John Boast's work, he argues that to be a riot you needed to have sort of 50 individuals involved. If you read the Riot Act, it says 12 individuals. Both are equally kind of arbitrary. But I'd say that kind of Boast's qualification is perhaps kind of unhelpful, not least in the countryside, in smaller communities, where it's necessarily going to be kind of harder to get kind of larger numbers of individuals involved. And who's to say that something with 50 individuals involved is any more of an important and politically kind of challenging form of collective action than a riot that had 49 individuals involved. It seems kind of arbitrary. We also know as well from the work of June Shepherd and others that many 18th century towns had large populations of agricultural workers, individuals who might live in the towns but would go out into the surrounding countryside, to neighbouring kind of farms every day to do their work. We know that many kind of towns in southern England and the Midlands had kind of growing kind of suburbs which were semi-rural. We can think of Thomas Hardy's kind of later work, thinking about the semi-rural slum-like conditions of the settlement of Fordington on the edge of Dorchester. The town and the countryside were not these two kind of entirely kind of discrete separate realms, but were permeable in the lives of many individuals. Many agricultural labourers would have families living in towns. Many would need, indeed, to go shopping for certain goods in towns as well, let alone going into towns at certain times of year for certain kind of customary ritual activities, or just to go to the pub. So, rural food riots then. This is an interesting way of thinking about the mobility of collective actions in the 18th century. During the first truly national wave of food rioting in the 18th century, so the subsistence crisis of 1756 to 1757, of the 7 food riots I found that occurred in the county of Sussex during that crisis, all took place in rural parishes or involved bodies of rural labourers entering market towns. Every single one. Though in the case of a rather partial invasion of Lewes in East Sussex, reports differed as to the strength of the force invading the town. The Lewes Press, for instance, suggesting that a body of 200 poor people from several parishes had entered the town, while the famous diarist Thomas Turner of the small East Sussex parish of West Hoathly kind of noted that about 40 people out of several neighbouring parishes came into Lewes today in a kind of riotous manner in order to demand corn of a person who has lately bought up a large quantity, who very readily offered them any quantity they would have at 6 shillings a bushel, which prevented any further disturbance. So one might kind of argue it's a fairly kind of partial rising in a riotous, in a kind of riotous manner. It doesn't really suggest something which is massively threatening, but still an important form of crowd action. These individuals had gathered together, had come from multiple rural parishes, clearly had a plan, had some degree of organisation, communication, coordination, came into the town, created an impression. The local press to report something like this, clearly thought there was something interesting here. The diarists to actually kind of note it down, clearly thought there was something interesting here, and had a degree of success. A mob that gathered at nearby Hurst Green in East Sussex in May 1757. And Hurst Green is a really obscure little place. Then just a very small hamlet, about 7 miles north of Battle, where the Battle of Hastings was in 1066, my word. I'm almost a historian here. On the road to London. So a mob gathered there, and that was reportedly about 2,000 individuals strong. That was probably a significant exaggeration, but it was kind of close by to the small market town of Hawkhurst, just over the border into Kent, which was the centre of a then very active and notorious smuggling gang. This group, even if it's not 2,000, even if it's several hundred, this is quite interesting. They stopped a wagon loaded with corn on the London road. This would have required considerable force. The disturbance was also thought to be kind of serious enough that the military were called out. The military then managing to kind of appease this very mobile crowd, having gathered together from kind of multiple kind of rural parishes, and took a couple of ringleaders into custody. Quite a dramatic action. Less dramatic arguably though, was the seizure of a wagon, again loaded with corn, at again another obscure little kind of hamlet called Rooks Hill, en route to kind of Chichester in the west of Sussex in June, by a small mob of women. But again, even this rather less dramatic incident spoke to the depth of feeling in the countryside about food being exported from agrarian communities. So rural workers, even though they may have had different sources of access to food, the fact that food is being exported from communities was kind of a source of tension, a source of conjecture.
We've lost the call.
Oh my word! Okay, I shall.
Yeah, sorry.
I shall
get it back.
I shall pause before we then go on to a very exciting.
Where's the code?
Go back. If you get there.
Okay, cool.
That doesn't look good. You can't click on the call. What have you managed to do?
I haven't got a clue. I wasn't touching it, honestly.
You can now.
Shall I just call it, yeah?
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm doing. Yes, you do. Oh, dear.
You find C.
Yeah, we have it. It's recording to us, apparently. Yeah, we're just trying to do something about this. Got any idea? Right, folks, we might be back. Can you give us a wave if you can hear and see us okay? Fantastic. We'll see if we can now share the PowerPoint. I never asked if you could actually see the PowerPoint, but I'm kind of imagining you could, so I'll try again, or we'll try again with that. There you go. Can you see the PowerPoint now? Fantastic. Right, Carl, back over to you. Thank you very much for your help, everybody.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure where I lost you, but I'm gonna kind of pick up at what I think is a sensible point. So there's a few kind of examples that demonstrate the depth of kind of popular feeling about food being exported from agrarian communities. A depth of feeling that ran very deep indeed. Such incidents, I'd argue, though, were somewhat kind of overshadowed by what was about to occur elsewhere in Sussex. A wave of collective action that took place over 2 days that started at Petworth, a small agrarian market town in West Sussex, which was also the seat of the Earls of Egremont. A mob, and I quote, of 500 men with 100 women and children rose in the town. It's unlikely that a small town like Petworth could kind of muster so large a force, and it's highly kind of likely that many of these individuals came from some of the surrounding villages as well. They visited with a clear plan. They were visiting a dealer, a jobber called Hampton, to offer him a premium for the wheat he had been hoarding in his warehouse. Clearly there was this strong local knowledge about Hampton's actions. The crowd was going along, using these kind of classic moral economy codes to offer him a price. Hampton refused. At this point, kind of normal kind of moral economy kind of codes broke down. They broke in, took 7 loads and 4 bushels of corn, which they then took to the town green and placed it out, scattered it about the green for anyone to help themselves to. And there are these glorious reports of some people kind of carrying corn away in bags, other people kind of using using kind of the folds of their clothes to carry as much corn as they possibly could and trying to get it back home. This was a great success. So the following day, the same people, how we can be certain they're precisely the same people, probably a slightly kind of different composition, gathered and went to a place called Aversdale at Agrarian Pulborough, which is about kind of 7.5-8 miles east of Petworth. From Aversdale, gosh, I can just about read that. From there they took from thence 3 loads and sold it at 5 shillings a bushel. That's three loads of corn. Then they took 3 more loads from a neighbouring place and gave it to anybody who wanted it. Their number increased hourly, so that it is so large now that they talk of dividing into 2 bodies, one to take the west of the county, the other to take the eastern road. They're all armed, some with prongs, some with picks, some with shovels, and such kinds of weapons. They search all the mills, but they do no mischief unless they find quantities of hoarded corn. They search Mr. Winton's house at Hardham, but finding no more than was necessary for his family, they meddled with nothing. They had, apparently, before they'd set out to the edge of Pulborough, applied to the justices, to the magistrates at Petworth, but getting nowhere. So they were on an expedition, the report claimed. They are countenanced by great numbers, who give them victuals and drink as they go from place to place. We also know that on that day, the second day of collective action in West Sussex, that some of the group went to Arundel, where they took a barge on the River Arun, laden with corn. We don't know how far they managed to take it. I'm not quite sure how they managed to move the thing at all. It's quite impressive, really. Or some of the group went in the other direction to a plan to go to kind of Chichester. News of their plans to head to Chichester, kind of reach the city though, and a party of dragoons was dispatched out to meet this very mobile posse. The men and the women dispersing, although not until 5 prisoners had been taken, and the barge was retaken and delivered back to its owners in Arundel. Again, we don't know how far this barge got, but I thought they managed to move a barge laden with corn. Amazing. This was evidently then a complex, constantly evolving coalition that knitted together rural parish and market town, rural workers, evidence of the tools they were carrying, and townsfolk that moved seamlessly between town and country, that was understood, that drew on wider support, and that had multiple tactics and targets. What's more, they were clearly organised. For so many people, even allowing for the exaggeration in the reports, to come together and have a clear target, a clear set of targets, and a strategy. This was not random. This was not the result of happenstance, but nor was it entirely bound by moral economy rules. This was no stately gavotte. Food was seized and not paid for in some instances, Hampton paying the price for not accepting the people's premium offered. Vital here to understanding this, then, is their mobility. And this took several forms. Whilst we don't know about the precise composition of the crowd, certainly not on the first day, we know that the plan involved for several critical movements. The ringleaders coming together beforehand to devise a plan, for the message and plan to circulate Petworth and the surrounding villages, for the activists to proceed from their houses and places of work to assemble together before proceeding to Hampton's warehouse on the first day. The mobility of the events on Tuesday are somewhat more kind of obvious and explicitly kind of detailed in the reports, but what is implicit and not kind of related is evidently that the news of the success of the events on the first day, on the Monday, had spread through the locality. Good news travels fast here. Energy and momentum then were vital. This was a short-lived but joyous mobile assembly. To define it, to map it, that's one riot, even 2 riots, is to deny the complexity of actions and the complexity of the geographies involved. Food riots could be, I'd argue, many-headed hydra. If the example of West Sussex in June 1757 is an extreme case, an extreme example, the archive is also kind of littered with evidence of other slighter collective actions that went well beyond the marketplace too. Indeed, elsewhere that year, food rioting was even more pronounced in neighbouring Hampshire and in Wiltshire, with numerous cases of smaller groups of rural workers stopping wagons loaded with corn bound for export. So, for instance, at the small New Forest market town of Fordingbridge in early May, a group of 26 men, very precise that, armed with axes, hooks and clubs. So these were probably kind of woodland workers, visited a mill at the edge of the town, stating that they would not eat barley bread any longer and had come to destroy the mill, milling this kind of offensive flour being used. The case is instructive. Having entered the mill and having started on the destruction of the mill tackle, they were warned of their actions and told that if they stopped, the owner of the mill, Mr. Portsmouth, would give them some money, 2 guineas apparently mentioned. On this, the men left and went to go and find Mr. Portsmouth, who was then in the centre of Fordingbridge. Here, they demanded 5 guineas. Why not? Why not chance your arm? Otherwise, they would return and totally destroy his mill. He refused. They again restated their demands, but also another miller being present, a Mr. Neve, having a mill also on the outside of Fordingbridge on the Avon there, demanded 5 guineas from him too. We want 5 guineas from you, Portsmouth, 5 guineas from you, Neve, and if we don't get our 10 guineas, we're going to destroy both your mills. Apparently, Neve and Portsmouth gave in. Rather than returning home flushed with their successes, the men proceeded to Bicton Mill, securing a further 2 guineas, to the mill at Ringwood, where they secured a further 10 guineas, but ran out of kind of steam before they managed to visit the final kind of large mill in the vicinity of Longham. These were men from the parishes on the border between Hampshire, Wiltshire, and Dorset. They were from the hinterlands of the New Forest and Cranbourne Chase. These were archetypal kind of rural workers having come into the town. The example then is messy, it's energetic, it's clearly very mobile and defies categorisation. It altogether kind of evades kind of both kind of narrow kind of definition of kind of riot and appears as one dot on Andrew Charlesworth's mapping of the events of 1757, which is clearly so unsatisfactory for something which involves multiple kind of sites at multiple times. Focusing only on the major national waves of food rioting is also to kind of deny the importance of other forms of kind of rural food rioting. So crudely put, during national kind of waves, they're bound to kind of overstate the importance of kind of town-based food riots, because we know that the example of successful risings in one town would encourage risings in neighbouring towns. That's something absolutely kind of true also of the cases that Jim Hunter details in Scotland in 1847. Going outside of these national kind of waves, you then find kind of evidence of other food riots the historians haven't bothered to analyse in the past. So, for instance, in Dorset, a county for which the major kind of historian of protest for that county, Kevin Bourne, claims that rural workers didn't engage in food rioting at all. Food riots occurred in lots of kind of rural parishes if you look outside of the waves of national protest. So the small market town of Bempster in November 1764, again agrarian Marnell and Stallbridge in 1765, the same year in which in the villages around Bradford and Avon and neighbouring Wiltshire, the common people stopped every wagon that passed through to prevent corn from being exported. In Kent, particularly around kind of Tenterden, in the Weald, in 1768, so 2 years after a major national wave of food rioting, a gang had assembled in the town with the intention of raising a larger mob. They were then going to go out to Woodchurch Green, which was then an emergent squatters' settlement on the manorial waste of that parish, to force the farmers to sell their wheat to the millers or to the poor people at £10 a load, threatening to destroy the mills of any millers who paid too much for their corn. When 3 members of this kind of nascent kind of body were arrested and conveyed back through the streets of Tenterden, more members of kind of the surrounding countryside, having been in the town, assembled in a very daring manner, rescued them. Several years later, in May 1790, going back to kind of Petworth in Sussex, between 100 and 200 members of the peasantry assembled in the town with large sticks to complain at the price of flour. The crowd claiming that they might as well be killed at once as starved to death, adding that they would have flour cheaper as there was no scarcity, or they would grind the miller. But none of this is to absolutely deny that the closer social bonds and systems of social control, the cultural and political hegemony that E.P. Thompson wrote so persuasively about, did not play out more strongly in the countryside than it did in the towns. It evidently did. But threats and the tools of rural terror were vital at moments when collective action, for whatever reason, wasn't possible in the countryside. So we know as well that during that national crisis in 1757, to go back to Sussex, an incendiary attack on the barn of a farmer at Hailsham in that county was alluded to in an incendiary threatening letter addressed to the gentry and gentlemen farmers of the nearby parish of Ninfield. And this letter kind of wrote, "As there hath been in a neighbouring parish a barn of corn destroyed by fire, if wheat be not fell to the price of 5 shillings per bushel, the same calamity will happen in this parish and several parishes adjoining. For the thing is decreed and will soon be put into execution, if not prevented by the fall of corn. Also several dwelling houses are conspired against, and I do assure you there will be but very few barns standing in this parish and many others joining in a month's time." The pseudonymist signed off by saying, "As mobs and magistrates will not prevail, we will run the hazard of our lives before we will starve." So here, collective action was deemed not to be possible. And we know as well in the aftermath of that extraordinary kind of 2 days of collective action around kind of Petworth and Arundel, that threats were made to destroy a very large mill at nearby Siddlesham. The threats were taken so serious that the owner of the mill spent £100 reportedly on protecting his property with cannon, small arms, and keeping scouts out at all time to have a look. But simplistic models, which suggest that both the extension of the net of rural poor relief payments during the later crisis of 1795 and the suppression of the national wave of food rioting in 1795, particularly in the summer and the autumn of that year, which again tied together town and country. I can give you loads more examples from 1795, but we don't have time, and you don't need them. Acted all together to suppress this long-established tradition of rural food rioting, when again the country was thrown into a subsistence crisis in 1800, is far off the mark. So to give you some final examples, to return to the parish of Dorset, we know in the spring of 1800, at Blandford, then a substantial kind of market town, a very serious mob, not only of our own people, but from the neighbouring villages, collected in our streets, demanding bread at their own prices, before then marching to a mill 3 miles off, where they were met by the local yeomanry and dispersed. So again, we have kind of a plan. We have organisation which transcends town, which transcends the neat and artificial divide between town and country. We have groups coming into the town and kind of meeting with the townsfolk. We have them then going out into the countryside to these mills here. Kind of planning, organisation, and mobility and energy are equally important. Elsewhere in Dorset, that year at rural Cerne Abbas, the place that people kind of know largely for the Priaptic giant kind of carved into the chalk downs looming over the village. A gardener came into the village and tried to sell potatoes, which in southern England in 1800 was truly a famine food, and carrots at extortionate prices, when women collected together from the village and in a cool and determined manner insisted on him delivering them at a shilling the peck for the potatoes and 2p a bundle for the carrots, to which he assented. So again, a rather small kind of action that doesn't kind of figure on any of these kind of large kind of surveys of kind of food rights or collective action, but is no less kind of important. So maybe a few conclusions then. What might we draw from this? Okay, and I'm going to get slightly kind of Robertson on you again here. As the pervasive influence of Gilles Deleuze on the critical humanities reminds us, in everything there is an excess of life over and above the categories that seek to contain it. So in coming up with kind of neat models, and there can be no neater model than E.P. Thompson's moral economy thesis, we of course at once kind of draw out and explain certain parts of social action, social complexity, but also kind of deny and blindside other aspects. So historical protest, I'd argue, might benefit from such kind of a vitalist realisation, and not altogether abandoning models. They are useful, of course, but embrace the multiplicities of the crowd, to embrace its immanence and its rhizomatic nature, rather than trying to map every bloody thing. Of course, mapping and charting have their place. They really do, and I should say that as a geographer. I would be to deny my intellectual birthright. But we might wish to dig deeper, to break beyond spots on maps, to move beyond models of diffusion, and to question the complex geographies that make up all protest episodes, the comings together, the organisations, the movements beforehand, as well as that which kind of happens, which is not planned for. To allow for possibilities beyond neat models, to allow for things beyond custom, or customary forms of behaviour, to allow for messiness. And we need to understand that these moments, these forms of collective kind of action, are not necessarily either kind of geographically contiguous or occur in a temporally linear way. They can often kind of unfurl in really kind of unpredictable and really kind of quite complex ways. So by paying attention, I'd argue, to the interplay between kind of the rural and the urban, by challenging those neat kind of categories, the neatness of those spaces, the protesting crowd can become something which eludes the deadening effects of our attempts to place and to fix everything in space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so have you time for questions?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm sure we have got questions. I don't know how to get the screen up onto multiple people, so I'm going to have a willing volunteer to help me here. Fantastic, thank you. That'll make it easier for us to see if folks out in BC land have some questions for us. And thank you. That's really helpful.
I want to go with this one.
Where are you going now?
Because that means the person that speaks comes up first.
Right. Thank you. That's really good. So I think we'll begin with people on VC, and then we'll bring it back into the room. So if there are any questions out on VC, I'd invite them now. Otherwise, we'll have silence.
which is fine. One of the things I'm missing about not teaching this year is not having awkward silences.
Tumbleweed. Okay, well, we'll give you guys a chance to think, if you like, and open it up to the floor here now.
I was wondering what relationship burning barns of corn and destroying mills had to food riots, since it's not doing anything to actually get any food when you do that.
It does seem an utterly kind of perverse act. It really does. The logic in kind of burning barns of corn or stacks of corn is that, well, if we can't consume it, if it's going to be kind of exported, then why should anyone else? And the thought is that, you know, that maybe kind of one kind of salutary kind of example might kind of impact upon kind of the marketing kind of practices of kind of other farmers and those who kind of sought to hoard their corn. So there is kind of a logic at play, but it is perverse. Examples in kind of collective kind of actions of corn being kind of deliberately kind of despoiled are kind of relatively kind of few and far between. And sometimes we can't simply be kind of certain whether, you know, whether something simply kind of went wrong. You know, an attempt to kind of, you know, liberate kind of corn from kind of, you know, from kind of a barge kind of laden up for kind of export, you know, was pitched into the river by mistake when they were trying to carry it away, for instance. So examples of kind of deliberate kind of spoiling in that context are few and far between, and often I think we need to problematise them. But burning did have a logic, but a perverse one.
I wondered if another one around burning, this is a communications device, and you said good news travels fast, but how does it travel? But what easier sight in a flat, back to space again, flat rural landscape is a burning barn. You know that is so-and-so's barn. It's up in flame. If you're in an urban setting, you can tell your friends and the people around you, we're going to have a riotous assembly or whatever you want to call it. And in a rural environment, that signals to people 20, 30, 40 miles away that so-and-so's barn is going up, it's time to get ready.
It's hugely powerful as a symbol. It really is. And on some of my kind of earlier work on the swing insurrection in the rural kind of south and east in 1830, there's kind of lots of kind of evidence that the kind of communities at kind of a distance would kind of read fires, would see that as kind of evidence of the protest having kind of spread to kind of new localities. That and kind of fire engines being drawn out of the streets of nearby towns and going off along the roads. Both could be kind of really kind of powerful kind of warnings about what was happening, but also kind of a powerful way in which kind of protests could spread as well. Definitely. Yeah.
It's not really strictly relevant to your thesis, but why were potatoes considered a famine food in southern England? And I know in France it was the same.
Yeah. The one thing that's really kind of striking, particularly about the two kind of later kind of subsistence crises that I briefly touched on, that of 1795 and 96, and that of 1801, is that so many of the protests, particularly in the countryside, were around the consumption of substitutes. And by substitute, I mean kind of anything other than the perfectly pure white standard loaf, which was so strongly kind of tied up with the identity and the dignity of the southern labourer, that to be forced to eat something like potatoes, something out of the ground, was almost kind of worse than being kind of offered kind of rice as a substitute, or kind of offered kind of barley bread, or even kind of brown bread as a substitute to the white bread. I mean, if you're an agricultural labourer, you don't have a great deal. You don't have much in the way of kind of dignity. If the one thing you kind of hold on to, your last kind of shred of kind of self-determination and dignity is around, well, I labour for a wage and I spend most of that wage on food. I want this food to be good. And the white loaf was thought to be, the standard white loaf was thought to be the pinnacle. So potatoes are, in the south of England, really are thought to be, food for pigs. And there are lots of kind of examples of in 1795 in particular, I've not found any in 1800, where kind of parishes tried to give potatoes as a form of de facto relief, almost kind of relief in truck, if you like, and they were discarded by the poor, thrown symbolically to the pigs. Yeah.
I find that interesting because my father spent a number of years living in Malawi, and there was a number of years of food shortage in the time that he was there. And at one point, my mum was out visiting, and there was a lady at the side of the road selling, piles of potatoes and tomatoes and so on. She said, "Please buy some of my potatoes. I need money to feed my children in sima," which is a sort of flour paste thing, which is their staple diet. And Mum said, "Why can't you feed them the potatoes?" And we never got a solution to what to us was a very peculiar way of thinking, but. I think perhaps it was that Nsima was seen as the staple. That's what you had to have. Everything else was an added extra. And so you needed to provide your family with the staple food. And I wonder, it just sounds very similar to
I'm sure you're right. I'm sure it was kind of linked up with self-identity as well. Yeah. This is what we eat, and therefore we want to continue eating it. We demand to continue eating it, not potatoes or tomatoes. It seems kind of odd to us now, doesn't it? But and the example of kind of potatoes is kind of seen as kind of family food in the eyes of kind of the southern English labourer would have been kind of read very differently in kind of different parts of England, let alone kind of parts of Scotland and Ireland by 1800. But the marketing of kind of potatoes existed at a very kind of low level and kind of southern kind of market towns, and it's kind of really kind of telling then that things got so kind of desperate in the summer of kind of 1800 that you would have an example. The example I gave was from St Abbas, but I could think of several others in the summer of 1800 of kind of individuals protesting over the price of potatoes, something that would normally kind of not raise any concern at all. I'm not going to protest about the marketing of kind of potatoes because we're not going to consume them. It's not to say that individuals didn't grow some potatoes, didn't supplement kind of diets, but it was generally not something that individuals would willingly go and buy. Not in the south and east. Things kind of changed over the next kind of three decades. And by kind of the 1830s, it's not kind of uncommon to see kind of reports of farm sales, including kind of several kind of even on small farms, particularly in kind of the Weald of Kent and Sussex, several kind of acres of potatoes or potatoes in store. So in 1845, when the potato blight is first kind of manifested, it's first manifested in potato plots in the Weald of Kent, before then kind of spreading kind of infamously to Ireland and to Scotland, having devastating effects in the Black 47. But it's not something that it's kind of quite an interesting kind of case of the diffusion of kind of agricultural practices and change in consumption practices. That that if the potato hadn't been kind of taken up in the particularly in the 20s and 30s in the south and some parts of the South by some agrarian communities. Yeah. Perhaps the diffusion of the blight may have been slowed. It's an interesting hypothesis, but of course it was first manifested at all that year in the Netherlands. It spread over the Netherlands and into Kent.
Were there any sort of reference to leaders rising up in these riots and assemblies, and it's like crowd processes. Usually leaders as well, or no mention of them in the
of ringleaders.
Well, leaders just rising up within the brew house. Or the crowd.
Particularly these kind of the mid 18th century examples I'm using. Kind of the reports were often relatively thin, which partly kind of explains the rather kind of formulaic kind of way in which they've been kind of read kind of hitherto. From the crises of 1795 and 1800, there's lots more kind of evidence of kind of charismatic, powerful, evident kind of leaders taking kind of a critical kind of role, particularly in kind of conversations in kind of parleys, then with kind of millers or bakers or magistrates or parish kind of overseers, members of the clergy, individuals almost kind of position themselves as kind of the spokesperson of the group. This is what we want. Much less so in the mid 18th century. And it's partly here that and this is where kind of the record is so frustrating, because we know that individuals were kind of singled out to be arrested during 1756 and 57. Individuals were targeted because of the prominent roles they took. Nothing else makes a great deal of sense. I mean, in some cases, if you're a member if you're a member of the military going to kind of suppress kind of a collective disturbance, you might kind of grab the person who's running away. I mean, that makes some sense as well. But you'd go for the individuals who were most prominent. But then the legal reports are so thin. So the last couple of days I've been luxuriating in the North Yorkshire County Record Office in Northallerton, looking at some quarter sessions kind of records, including some stuff for 1795-96 and subsistence response to the subsistence crisis in North Yorkshire, and the reports in even the legal informations, the presentments, the depositions is so thin that it doesn't even kind of present these individuals who clearly took kind of leading roles as having took leading roles. Rather, the only thing that was kind of trying to be established was that these individuals, were present, that they were involved in some way. And often kind of the newspaper reports of kind of a lot of these kind of early kind of food riots are so thin as well that there's not much kind of evidence.
Is that maybe intentional to give the figurehead to it would
possibly
incite further unrest?
This charismatic kind of leader who's but that's quite possible. It's a really good point.
But then of course you get Ned Ludd, you get Rebecca, you get Captain Swing. They're all kind of mythical leaders as well as maybe some substance behind them somewhere. So you do get these figures, but you don't seem to get them quite in the same way in food riots.
Here's an interesting thing. This is obscure, but the first group that kind of acted in breaking threshing machines during the Swing Rising of 1830 in kind of the rural southeast England was a guy called Henry Wood, and it's his gang who kind of first kind of uses the word swing. And he kind of lived in kind of a house in a small parish in kind of Elam that was later kind of lived in by Aubrey Hepburn. So from kind of one type of leader to
another.
So they should have called themselves the Hollywood kind of the Hollywood lights.
So I'm going to ask my question now.
I knew it was coming.
Yeah.
The answer's no.
It's too long a question. Actually, no, you could answer no to my question. So, obviously thinking about the land wars, Highland land wars, and there's many questions I could ask around this really interesting thesis, and particularly about this, this not abandonment of space and place, but this kind of shrinking away from space and place. And for me, the land wars are actually very much about space and place. They people target really small individual pieces of land to take. I'm not really going to ask about that, but it does spin off from that in a way, because a wider question is, I'm just wondering whether you're actually creating or recreating a polo mint. So I wrote that down, so I wanted to get that in. You see, look, I've even put a little box around it as well. So, are you creating a polo mint? So, by taking space and place out of the picture, or kind of removing it, you're leaving, the crowd action in a particular space and place.
What I'm absolutely not doing is taking place and space out of it, but I'm redrawing it. I'm saying that our current kind of conceptions have this very kind of narrow understanding of the way in which particularly kind of space works in relation to forms of collective action. That we have been absolutely obsessed with either being able to kind of mark it on a map, it happened there, it happened then, or we've been kind of obsessed, particularly in kind of recent work, a lot of work which is brilliant and has advanced understandings in so many ways, but it's led to kind of other kind of problems unforeseen, these unintended kind of intellectual consequences, which have sought to kind of offer these kind of rich contextualizations of why things happen in the way in which they do in that place. And the archive lends itself quite well to that. What I'm doing is saying that, well, actually, trying to kind of, obsessing about X marking the spot, or then kind of reading and offering these kind of rich contextualizations of why things kind of happen where they do, fails to account for the importance of the mobility of all forms of collective action. Things never just happen at X. There are all sorts of kind of actions and movements which lead to X. Forms of collective action, even if they did kind of to the dot kind of follow kind of moral economy kind of codes, that they were these kind of were kind of neatly kind of choreographed and utterly kind of predictable, also involved all sorts of kind of other forms of kind of movement on the spot. Not every kind of individual is acting exactly the same way at that point in time. There's much more in the way of kind of argy-bargy, of kind of pushing and shouting, of coming and going, and of course movement away from that particular moment. And as I've kind of shown some of the examples I've drawn, particularly from 1757, often one action, one kind of event that might be easily marked on a map at one particular point in time, often then could have led to other actions kind of happening in different places. And of course, there's this movement between these different, between mills, between different marketplaces. But it's the movements between people's kind of houses and their kind of places of work, the places in which they then kind of plotted and kind of organised and kind of socialised beforehand, and the places they went to kind of to drink their successes or bemoan their failures kind of afterwards. So we have this much more kind of dynamic conception of movement, of mobility. So it problematises this kind of hard kind of version of space, which has crept into kind of writings of space and place. And Ian, I would never dream of saying that you kind of fell into this model. Your kind of writings are much more kind of much more kind of subtle, if that's the right phrase. But work on the 18th century, the early 19th century, is so kind of dominated by this particular kind of hard conception of place and space. So much of the work on the broader kind of spatial term does have this kind of quite hard kind of understanding. And I'd argue it's problematic. It rides roughshod over other forms of complexity and the messiness that's so often important in a riot being effective.
I think you're probably right. But I will, unless there's any final questions around the room here, around the table here, I'll give people on VC a chance for one final or two final questions, and then we'll wrap it up. No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for... Oh, yes.
That's what it is. The time period covering the food wars here in the 1750s and 1790s, would the effect, of course, the wars going on at this time as well would have an effect on the food prices and the lack of availability at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's... I mean, at once I've tried to kind of make the argument that we need to kind of also move beyond kind of looking at these kind of major kind of national waves of kind of food rioting. But the major kind of national waves, I mean, occur when they do for very good reason. It's often around it's around the impact of kind of militarisation on kind of provisioning practices. Having to kind of provision for kind of a large kind of standing army. That's that requires a lot more kind of food than under normal conditions. It requires food moving out of the country, and particularly out of the countryside, going to kind of barracks or even being kind of shipped overseas in some cases, and that's going to have a profound kind of impact upon how, upon of course the price, and of course upon kind of the availability of foodstuff, and it impacts upon the quality of kind of foodstuffs as well. I mean, in those kind of occasions, there's kind of lots of kind of evidence that the other forms of kind of market manipulation become a problem as well. So the adding of kind of things like kind of alum to flour becomes a real problem in 1795, of kind of of trying to kind of use kind of slightly kind of dodgy kind of weights and kind of measures. Again, becomes a really kind of hot issue in the 1790s, where it hasn't been kind of an issue in the 1780s, or even an issue during the wave of food riots in 1772. So the impact of war is massive. It's absolutely kind of dramatic indeed. But it doesn't necessarily kind of impact directly upon the protest forms that are adopted in all localities. And I'll kind of issue kind of a couple of kind of caveats there. In 1795 in particular, militia kind of regiments stationed kind of away from home were very active participants in and even kind of instigators of some of the most visceral of kind of food riots, and several kind of individuals were kind of court-martialed and lost their lives for being involved. And of course, in some locations, because of the very kind of strong kind of military presence during the several kind of landscapes are heavily militarised, that it perhaps kind of impacts upon the ability of some communities to kind of collectively kind of organise, that you might think kind of otherwise if you've got a regiment kind of stationed down the road when you didn't normally. We know that lots of kind of rural barracks were built, particularly kind of in the southeast in the 1790s, when they wouldn't be kind of used to having kind of the presence of kind of soldiers otherwise. So.
Great. I'm very much aware that folks in Inverness are going to get booted out of their room any minute now, so I think we'll...
Yeah, knocking on the door, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. It was very enlightening. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure.
Yeah, and indeed, thank you to everybody out in VC land and everybody here, but particularly thank you very much to Carl. Thank you. Great, and I'm sorry the room got so blooming cold in the end.
Was it?
This call has been disconnected. Thank you for joining.